Sí, hola. Aquesta sessió és sobre les tecnologies blockchain i veurem com poden ser utilitzades aquestes tecnologies per millorar l'administració pública i també veurem quines són les limitacions d'aquestes tecnologies. Començaré amb una presentació molt breu del que és la tecnologia blockchain i per què es pot utilitzar. Començarem per Bitcoin primer.
Decentralized cryptocurrency, which has been created in 2009. And the particularity of this digital currency is that it is not operated by any central bank and it is not controlled by any government. So it is based on a decentralized peer-to-peer network, and every user that is connected to this network is actually in charge of verifying every transaction. So, of course, eventually, the Bitcoin has actually shown that there is something much more beyond this. And what is actually really interesting of these new technologies is the underlying system on which it relies, which is the blockchain. And the blockchain is basically the abstraction of the model of the decentralized currency and just looking at how this actually is made. So this decentralized database, which is storing information and which is maintaining some kind of traceability of all the transactions that have been done on this. So over the time, there is people have started to realize that what can be done on the Bitcoin network, which is it is possible to create some kind of scripting language to create some conditional. So, for instance, if I send a transaction to someone, I can choose, for instance, to what are the conditional in which the transaction can be spent afterwards. The problem is that it is really limited in the sense that it has to follow the transaction itself. So people have started to develop alternative blockchains which have new capabilities, which actually make it possible to create software on top of those on this decentralized database. So the result is that now, instead of just having a software which is run on a particular server, it is possible to run software on a decentralized network which is not operated by any given central authority. And so this created what the Economist has defined as the trust machine, which is probably a little bit misleading in the sense that the particularity of the blockchain is actually that it eliminates the need for trust. So it creates this trustless technology which enable people that do not know each other and therefore do not trust each other to interact with one another. And so the really useful thing that comes out of this technology is the ability to use it in order to create trustless transaction. So it can be used in order to replace the figure of a trusted intermediary and to eliminate this figure and instead to delegate the trust on the technology. So as long as people are actually trusting the network, then it is possible for them to interact with each other. So obviously the first application that have been created were financial application. The main reason is that indeed, in the case of most financial application, trust is not actually required if not for the fact of making sure that the transaction goes well. So when I transact money to someone or when I expect someone to give me money, the reason that we need to rely on a central intermediary like a bank is to make sure that the transaction actually goes through. If we actually eliminate this intermediary and we actually trust the network that this payment will actually be enacted, then it doesn't really matter if I trust or if I don't trust the person that I'm transacting with. The trustlessness of the technology is also quite useful in the context of the Internet of Things, because when we interact with devices, then most of the time we don't really need, or actually we don't want to need to trust the device we're interacting with. We just want to make sure that the transaction will go as it had been predefined. Now, of course, this same technology can also be used beyond those basic applications. And we will try to look now about how this technology can be used in order to empower citizens with technological means. So just as a disclaimer, I will now play the role of the good cop. So I will try and explain all the possible benefits that are provided by this technology, and then hopefully Rachel will actually contradict or actually play the bad cop role. So the first advantage that blockchain technologies provide is in terms of transparency and accountability. So the blockchain is this database which has particular specificities. First of all, it is a transparent database in the sense that every transactions that have been made on the blockchain are visible to all, because it's an actual requirement in order to verify the validity of those transactions. It is also incorruptible in the sense that every transaction is actually signed by a cryptographic key, so that it is impossible for people to pretend or to modify the content of this transaction by pretending that someone else has done the transaction. And then finally, it is append-only, because the data on the blockchain is just constantly being added on it, but it is impossible to eliminate a transaction from the past or even to modify it. And so in some way, the blockchain can be seen as this really incorruptible and tamper-proof database of an audit trail of every transaction which has been done until now. So this makes it really resilient against manipulation and corruption. And so these actually have quite an important impact in terms of storage for information. So today, in public administration, but like anyway, we rely on those centralized servers which are hosting the data for people. And those centralized data centers are, on the one hand, a single point of control, which means that those operators are actually controlling the data, and we do not have a control over what they do with the data, if they modify it or if they might lose it, etc. And it's also a single point of failure, because since if the actual data server collapse or if it breaks down, then the data is no longer available to anyone. In addition, it is obviously also an interesting point of attack, in the sense that there is more incentive for people to try and attack this server, because they can actually get all the data which is stored on this. And so with the blockchain, we can actually create more decentralized data management system, which can permit a more certified system for proving the authenticity and the integrity of the data. So this means that we can actually have like databases which are decentralized, where there is not a single operator that is controlling the data that is stored into this, and that every data that has actually been stored on this blockchain, it is possible to verify who has added it, what is the source of the transaction, and we also can know that the content of this transaction has not been changed because of the tamper-proofness and the append-only characteristic of the blockchain. So this can be really useful for like critical information that we need to make sure cannot be modified and cannot be corrupted. Of course, the data that is put on the blockchain does not necessarily has to be transparent. It can be encrypted, but you can rely on the blockchain as this secure data store. So the people can store the data, and then only those that actually have the decryption key can actually obtain the real information. And this is actually also useful in terms of for the individuals, in the sense that today we rely on those centralized servers to host information about ourselves, because oftentimes those are the certifications, those are the people that need to validate the integrity and the authenticity of the information. In those cases, we can actually use the blockchain for a particular authority to actually create a document, which is a certification, an authorization or something, and can issue it to person, but they can give the document, the digital document, they can actually hand it to the person. And what the certification authority does is just to hash code, so to create a unique identifier, a fingerprint of this document and store it on top of the blockchain, so that anyone else then, when I show, I can then host my own certification or my own authorization, and I can disclose it by my own to the person that needs to verify it. And instead of having to go and contact again the certification authority, they can just look at the blockchain. They can compare that the hash code of the file I have has effectively been validated on the blockchain in order to know that it is indeed a valid document. It is also possible, for instance, to do personal data management. So there is, for instance, the Enigma project that is now being developed at MIT, but there are other projects that are also going on. And the idea is that people can now have a more granular way of disclosing their personal data. So, for instance, I can choose. I can put data on a decentralized infrastructure, on a decentralized network, and this data is actually fragmented through all the nodes in the network. So no one actually has access to the totality of my data. So they cannot re-aggregate the content without colluding. And then I can use the blockchain in order to provide authorizations. So I can give, for instance, a token to someone, and I can say, with this token, you can now process information in the data without ever knowing what is the content of this information. So, for instance, as an example, we can think that I can store my personal data, I can store my date of birth on this decentralized network, and then an operator that needs to know if I am older than 18 years old does not actually need to get access to the raw data itself, but can just ask the network to actually make the processing of the question whether or not I am older than 18, and will only receive this answer in return. And with those particular tokens, I can choose what kind of data set I want which kind of operator to have. So this enables in some way to benefit from the big data analytics. So it is actually possible to preserve privacy and the confidentiality of the raw data while enabling operators, or while enabling myself to benefit from the customization of a service which is based on my personal data, but without disclosing the data. So I maintain the sovereignty over this data. And this is obviously also really useful in the context of governmental records. So it is possible to have more transparent records and more reliable ones. There have been a few experiments / initiatives. So the Estonian government has recently created a partnership with BitNation in order to provide notary service for their e-residents of Estonia. And the country of Honduras had actually planned to experiment with blockchain technologies in order to create a blockchain-based land registry that will be less subject to possible corruption. Now, another way in which the blockchain can improve public administration or private administration is by enabling a new mechanism of corporate and public governance. So one important element is the concept of technical accountability. So today we have a lot of laws that have specific regulatory objectives, and oftentimes those objectives are in order to ensure that the intermediaries that we give trust to are actually acting in the interest of their users. So this is mostly for fiduciary institutions. Now, with the technology, it is actually possible to achieve the same objective. So, for instance, in the case of the separation of duties that many financial institutions are subject to, in order to avoid that just one particular part of the institution has actually the power of doing something without having some kind of check and balance. There is some regulation that there needs to be the agreement, the consent of different parts of an organization in order for one operation to actually happen. And this can actually be automated by eliminating the need for this regulation by using technology, for instance, like an actual really basic technology, which is multi-signature, that is incorporated into the Beacon blockchain or the Ethereum blockchain, which basically makes it technologically impossible for just one party to do something without having the technological signature of all the other parties. So you can set up specific accounts or specific smart contracts, we can only be enacted when everyone is signing this transaction. Similarly, in the case of financial institutions, there is a lot of regulation and formalities that need to be done in order to prove that the institution has a sufficient amount of reserve, that they are actually solvent, that they didn't just create way too much money in order to be able to actually give back the money when the people come. And this is actually also possible to be solved technologically with mechanisms such as proof of reserve, which enable the institution to actually prove how much they have in their reserve and to prove that they are solvable by disclosing transparently what is their structure of reserve, but without disclosing the actual individual balances of their user. And so one of the really important things that the blockchain can actually do in order to support regulation is that it actually helps resolving the problem of who is watching the watcher. So today we have fiduciary institutions, which are or intermediary, which are the trusted intermediaries, which enable people to transact with each other. But every time we have a trusted intermediary, then we also have to make sure that we can trust this intermediary. And so we create the supervisor, we create oversights over those watchers. And the problem is that, of course, there is always a level in which we need to make sure that the person or the institution that are set up are not colluding or are not themselves being corrupted. With the blockchain, it is possible to actually eliminate this need by simply collapsing everything into technical rules. And the procedures and the accountability rules are encoded directly through the technology, and the technology is the one that is in charge of enforcing it. So as long as we can trust that the technology actually operates correctly, then we don't need to set up an oversight on top of, we eliminate the intermediaries, and therefore there needs to be no oversight on top of it. And then finally, we have the question of decision making. So today, most institutions are set up in this hierarchical and top-down manner where most of the decisions are done at the top of the management. And because of this, it is actually much easier to manipulate or to corrupt the decision, because just a little number of people that are actually at the top of the hierarchy can modify and divert a decision within the organization. In the context of the blockchain, it is possible to actually have a more distributed authority where the decisions are no longer made at the center or at the top of the organization, but actually at the edge. So we can create a more flat or decentralized structure, distributed structure, where every node that is on the network has a way to actually express themselves and make a vote. But the only way to corrupt the network is therefore to actually take over 51% of the people that have a vote. So it becomes more transparent in the sense that you can actually see exactly what are the decisions that are being made, what is the different impact that the decision have, and it becomes more difficult to actually act hideously or to corrupt a decision. In addition, so not just this is for the traditional legacy organization, but then we also, with the blockchain, have the possibility of creating alternative forms of organization which are more decentralized, organizations which are operated on a decentralized infrastructure, but that also incorporate a decentralized governance structure. And this enable a more distributed innovation where anyone basically inspired from the open source model, we can have anyone that can join and contribute to this organization in a much more cooperative or common-based way. And this creates much more flexibility. So instead of being stuck in this formal hierarchy and rigid structure that modern organizations have, with blockchain technology, we can have this really dynamic and agile structure in which people are joining the organization because they actually have something to contribute, and then they can be rewarded according to the contribution and according to the value that they have provided to those organizations. So to conclude, I will say that blockchain technologies today They started with Bitcoin technology, and because of this, they have been to some extent stigmatized. And much of the regulatory questions today are actually surrounding the question of how and whether we should regulate Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency. But it is important to notice that, in fact, there is much more than Bitcoin, and that the blockchain as a technology has nothing to do with decentralized cryptocurrency, but can be used for many other activities, which themselves are not necessarily going against the regulatory framework, but actually that could be used in order to improve it and to make it more efficient, to make it more transparent, and to make institutions more accountable. So on the other hand, of course, the technology can also be used by bad actors, etc. So there is some kind of need to regulate the technology, but it is important to see blockchain technology as an horizontal or general purpose innovation that can have an impact on many different sectors of activities, and not to look at it just as this vertical, which is Bitcoin. So my intuition is that blockchain technology actually can be an important support for current public administration and for current organization in general. So we should try and look, on the one hand, at what are the limitations that they bring, but we should also try and promote the use of those technology in a way that will actually enable this transparency and this accountability within the organization. So now, just to finish, I will say that there is an important limit to be taken. So I think that most of the people, they either look at the blockchain technology as like a really big enemy that need to be highly regulated, or they start seeing this technology as a really powerful tool that can be used in order to save the world. But I think there is a place in which we have to stop. And so, as a lawyer, I have been looking a lot at what is the impact of smart contracting. So the concept of really adopting this technology as a regulatory tool, and what are the benefits that it brings and what are the limits that it has. So, in some extent, the blockchain is actually bringing this concept of code is law, but is actually moving to a next step, which is when you actually start taking law and trying to incorporate it as an actual technical thing. So you start thinking of the code as an actual regulatory tools, then it has an actual potential really important impact on the legal system. So I will just spend some time on explaining the benefits and the difference between a smart contract and a legal contract. The benefits is, of course, that the smart contracts are transparent because, so as opposed to today, when we interact with online platforms, oftentimes we have no idea about what is going on inside this platform. It's like those kind of black boxes that we are interacting with. In the case of a smart contract that is deployed on the blockchain, it is actually transparent code, so people can look at the blockchain and can see what is the operation that are being done, and they are self-enforcing, so that they actually automatically will execute themselves when the conditions are met. So this obviously has a lot of incentive when we actually want this contract to be enforced, but this has a very important difference from traditional legal contract, in which the parties that enter into the contract actually always have the possibility of breaching the contract if they actually realize that maybe the contract wasn't a good one, and maybe they change their mind. So they have the freedom to breach the contract, and obviously they will have potentially to pay the consequence for that. When we actually move into the blockchain space, then the parties, once they enter into a smart contract, they are actually stuck into this contract. Because the technological framework that is governing the execution of the contract will just execute whenever the condition is met. So people are now bound technologically to the agreement. And so this has important consequence, because if we look at the actual legal framework, there are a lot of legal safeguards that might actually make a legal contract not to be valid or not to be enforceable. And those are, for instance, the case of undue influence, of information asymmetry, unconscionability, or incapacitation. And those rules are oftentimes completely ignored by the smart contract because they are simply not incorporated into the technological formalization of the smart contract. So this means that even though a legal contract will actually not be enforceable in the real world, then when we actually implement it into a smart contract, then there is no way for the user to actually claim that this was done through coercion or that it was just an unconscionable contract. The contract will be executed, and then it is up to the person that wants to actually change the effect of the contract to go and to raise the issue in court in order to actually reverse the effect. And then finally, there is this important distinction that I think is oftentimes forgotten, which is the fact that when we actually incorporate legal rules into a smart contract, we're actually losing all the nuance of the legal system, right? So we have the law, which is inherently flexible and ambiguous, and which is actually written in a way that it is expected that every word of the law needs to be interpreted by the judge in order to be applied to every different case. And when we actually formalize those into a smart contract, then we need to decide already, as we formalize the legal rules, we need to decide how they will be formalized into code. And those will just execute as is, regardless of the context in which they are, because the blockchain is just completely unaware of the physical context in which it operates. And it also obviously eliminates the concept of mercy and equity, which usually the judge can do. So yeah, just to conclude and to take back the language of Ethereum when they launched their smart contract platform. The idea was we can now code our own utopia. So it is now possible for people to create pretty much anything and to design or to create those trustless society in which they can design their own rule and they can actually create those polycentric system of decentralized laws. But if we actually push too far into this direction, even though this is actually, it has a lot of advantage. It has a lot of optimization and automation, etc., which can actually benefit a lot. If we actually go too far into this direction, then we can actually create a really dystopian version of the world. And instead of being into this beautiful and common-based system of rules that are actually emerging from the communities, we can actually end up in this really totalitarian situation where every rule is self-enforced and could actually be coerced. People could actually be coerced and obligated to actually follow those rules. So I will leave to, I guess this is the introduction to the bad cop version of Rachel.
Yeah, so is this working? So when Primavera and I were talking about this yesterday, we decided, as she said, that she'd be good cop and I'd be bad cop. But it sounds like, there's actually probably quite a lot of crossover, even in terms of how we're approaching it, because while I'm going to emphasize some of the problems that I see inherent in a blockchain, that doesn't necessarily mean that I think that it can't actually be used in particular contexts. So yeah, I don't know if I have to go through this very much because I think you give a really good technical overview, but just the one idea I suppose I wanted to put forward is quite non-technical. So I'd say, a blockchain is basically just a distributed database or a distributed ledger. So if you think of a traditional, like, centralized ledger, it'd be something like taking attendance, so where your teacher took cold roll in primary school. That'd be an example of a centralized ledger where your teacher is a trusted intermediary and they have one copy and one copy alone of the roll. If it says that you're absent, then that's basically that's the truth that's being trusted, and you need to come up with some kind of counter evidence to prove that you were actually there. So this would be, an example of a centralized database or ledger. With something like a blockchain, we can imagine that it's a roll call where everybody writes attendance. Everybody takes attendance and writes it, say, in permanent ink that you can't rub out, and holds it up for each other to verify. So we're moving away from the idea of, one single trusted intermediary towards a more sort of decentralized or distributed system where everybody is basically verifying the truth of a particular statement. With Bitcoin, or with the underlying, I suppose, the original purpose of blockchain, we're talking about maybe a shift from a traditional banking system, which again is a centralized intermediary where you have an accounting system or a ledger that keeps track of who sends money to whom and credits and debits accounts accordingly, towards a system where transactions are basically being monitored and verified by the entire network. And as Primavera said, we've seen a shift then away from the idea of it as being purely a financial technology or technology for verifying and solving kind of the double spending problem in digital money, towards any kind of application basically that could benefit from this kind of distributed database or ledger technology. I'm breaking it down here very reductively, maybe into 3 different poles that we've seen over the last year. In terms of applications for the blockchain. So the first being maybe some kind of anarcho-communist approach to the blockchain, where it's applications that can potentially replace some kind of centralized state with blockchains or distributed ledger technologies. So applications including money, maybe voting, also decentralized infrastructures, incentivizing forms of commons-based peer production, and so on. Probably the best or most elaborated of these 3, though, is the one in the center, which is actually fintech. So it's this kind of amalgamation of work that's happening in finance with kind of a tech Silicon Valley industry. And that's pretty much business as usual. So it's actually taking existing banking technologies and making them more robust with blockchain technologies. So we're seeing quite a lot of shift towards, an awful lot of collaborations between large banks and blockchain startups that are designed to do things like just faster credit clearing between private banks, for example, forms of asset management, forms of trading and settlement that can happen quickly and in a more transparent fashion. The third one then that we're seeing more recently, and which Primavera alluded to, is the use of the blockchain by the state or by governments to support different forms of public administration. So you mentioned some of the ones that come up all the time on CoinDesk, like I think the failed Honduras one. I don't think that actually is kicked off, but things like, the Estonian government looking at this. The one I think maybe, again, that's kind of well elaborated, even though it's not really been put into practice yet, would be something like this report, which was published recently by the UK government, which is called Distributed Ledger Technology, and looks at some of the applications of blockchains or blockchain-like technologies, with things like maybe developing digital identities on the blockchain, more transparent kind of funding in terms of where money is actually being put, monitoring tax evasion, smart property, developing liquid data markets for citizens' data, and again, voting and things. So these are quite different imaginaries of the blockchain. They also have quite different sort of infrastructures. So we're seeing a lot of discussions within, I suppose, fintech around this idea of a permission versus a permissionless blockchain. So generally when we're talking about blockchains with Bitcoin or something, it's sort of permissionless. So anybody can actually participate in verifying transactions. Quite a lot of the proposals we're seeing today are more permissioned. So you actually, they're kind of a distributed, but for whoever's actually sort of being invited to participate in that. And I think as we're seeing kind of people trying to negotiate some of the technical issues with the blockchain in terms of maybe scalability or sustainability, we're seeing potentially a shift as well towards these more sort of permissioned blockchains and more forms of kind of centralization around those, particularly as they're being applied by governments and by corporations. So yeah, as I said, bad cop. So I guess, where I wanted to begin was just with this idea, which you've probably come across maybe from Langdon Winner. So artifacts of politics. And this doesn't mean that they're deterministic, so they don't force a particular outcome, but there are particular political affordances or constraints that are embodied in different technologies. So just one example I thought of earlier would be if we think of something like a gait analysis technology, so technology that recognizes someone based on their individual gait. We can see how this kind of technology has loads of different applications. So it can be used to identify, used in smart houses for the elderly to identify if somebody's had a stroke, for example. It can be used on athletes to identify injuries. It can be used, well, potentially, I don't know if it'd be the most efficient one, but it could be used in, you know, some kind of a shopping experience where you're being identified by what you bought previously and being pushed, you know, Gap button downs or something. Or it can be used, say, in an airport where it could identify security risks or terrorist risks by, you know, identifying particular people through their gait. So what we're seeing here is that obviously there's loads of different applications with a particular technology, but at the same time, there's one kind of politics that we're seeing here in this particular example, which is concerned with the statistical reduction of population. So it expresses itself in different ways, but there is a dominant affordance. It doesn't, for example, facilitate anonymity or forms of resistance as easily. And I'd say we'd have the same kind of thing. There's a politics of the database. There's a politics of the ledger. And that politics kind of is based on, I suppose, developing new kinds of transparency or legibility of information. So I kind of like to position the blockchain within a long line of different technologies which are associated with recording data and making it more visible and more permanent. So the Hollerith punch card, for example, by IBM, which was kind of one of the first innovations to really sort of computerizing and gathering together citizen data in a particular way. This one actually, which Quinn DuPont and Bill Maurer looked up recently, which is a history of, the first kinds of automated ledgers, I guess, for finance from kind of the 1950s. So I pulled out a quote just because it would be very difficult to read. So they described this kind of technology as being fact power control, or, you know, permanent records. So businesses will be, you know, make these facts will be immediately available through these kinds of ledger technologies, allowing for executive decision and action. And I think this is maybe what the kind of politics then of ledger technologies, where we're seeing obviously an emphasis on making data, you know, more accessible, more transparent, more legible, more permanent, but also that there's a shift between not just storing information, but also enabling new kinds of action or decision to be made more quickly around data. So databases make it possible to organize large swathes of information, but they also allow kind of for connections between maybe rule structures and the outside world. So, you know, the Hollerith example, arguably, I haven't done like loads of research on this, but, you know, there has been research done on how this facilitated, for example, the identification of various different, you know, Jewish individuals or populations during World War II, and that it was quite significant. So, yeah, I guess just that we have to be aware that there's particular kinds of affordances of technology. So I had three just core criticisms then of the blockchain that I think actually tie in pretty well with some of what Primavera was saying towards the end. So the first is this idea, which I think she did a really good job of kind of giving the pros and cons of, which is that the blockchain delegates rules to a technical architecture. And we're actually even using the same kind of model. So I think a good way of understanding this is by using Lawrence Lessig, who's a professor of law. And he talks about 4 different quadrants of regulation. So we have laws, we have norms, we have markets, and we have architectures. So if you want to stop somebody from speeding past a primary school, you've got a couple of different ways of doing that. You can make a law that makes it illegal for somebody to do more than 30 miles per hour past the primary school. You could create kind of norms where you shame your neighbors or you shame other people and you exclude them if they persist in doing this. In a very dystopian world, there might be some kind of pricing system where if you paid enough, you would be allowed to speed past the primary school all you liked. Or finally, there's a sort of an architectural form of regulation where the decision is actually abstracted, it's taken away from you, and it's built into some kind of technical architecture. So examples of that would be something like, imagine maybe a car that doesn't allow you to speed in residential areas, which I don't think is too hard to actually imagine. Or even today we've got things like speed bumps, which are also examples of this kind of architectural control. So Primavera talked about this idea of law becoming code, or code as law, and I think that's potentially what we're seeing then with the blockchain. Again, going back to that report that I mentioned, the UK one about distributed ledger technologies that was published recently. So there's numerous references throughout this and throughout a kind of similar report that was produced by the, can't remember what they're called, a kind of science body anyway in the UK. They mentioned this idea of RegTech. So this is precisely this idea of basically taking, ascribing legal code into some kind of technical code, and in doing so reducing then costs of kind of administration or legal compliance, called RegTech. So what are some of the problems I see with that? Okay, the first is just the idea that you're delegating some kind of decision making to a system where there is basically no recourse. So you're creating some kind of new criteria for arbitration, but also for deciding, you know, what's true or what's right, that we don't necessarily have a kind of any, I suppose as Primera kind of pointed out, there's difficulty in terms of any kind of recourse in these automatically executing contracts. And this is particularly worrying when we're thinking about kind of permissioned blockchains as well, where maybe we don't even have any say in the actual arbitration of that. But secondly, I think it's just the idea that you can instantiate any kind of social institution by getting rid of, well, they're saying here the costs of legal compliance, but actually I feel like more broadly it's this idea that you can produce ideal institutions by getting rid of all the kind of messiness of human decision making and human collaboration. The second then, I suppose, is this idea that I think the blockchain is actually quite a limited model of politics. So I think this quote kind of sums it up quite well. So this idea that in its purest form, blockchain is democracy. And that's a very limited kind of understanding of democracy and of politics. So it's kind of a politics of consensus. So something that's based very much just on this kind of acceptance of a capitalist market and a liberal state as being the organizational foundations of a society. Foucault kind of argued that politics since the 18th century was really just about sort of creating knowledge institutions to reduce or to dispel conflict. And I think this is something that's kind of played out in examples like the blockchain. So the idea isn't really to kind of promote or to allow for any kind of discussion or debate, but to actually dispel conflict in favor of just some kind of consensus. So technologies like the blockchain arguably foreclose anything radical or truly political because it allows no room for radical dissent or agonism. It's kind of a more of the same. So as Chantal Mouffe argues, it's a consensus of the centre, just assumes that nothing really changes. So it's kind of a faux politics. The final example or criticism I'd make then is that technologies like the blockchain actually reproduce a liberal or a neoliberal economic subject. So they're reproducing the subject that they ostensibly maybe want to work against, at least in the kind of the blockchain for commons model. And I think this isn't just something that occurs with the blockchain. I think it's something that we need to be aware of in peer-to-peer work in general, which is that it kind of sets up the same institutions and modes. While it's trying to design, I suppose, a different outcome, it inostensibly actually reproduces the same kind of subject and sets up the same kinds of arrangements. I feel bad. I think maybe this is, you might know this person, but I just pulled up this quote because I thought it maybe gave a good example of this. So this is quite a utopian understanding of the blockchain, but it contains kind of within it then quite liberal language. So even while it's saying, you know, we need to move away from sort of a capitalist system towards something that's self-governing and that reproduces the commons, there is maybe inadvertently a reproduction of particular liberal ideas of kind of selfish individuals competing for resources who need, you know, economic incentives or some kind of game theory in order to contribute or reproduce the commons. So, for example, this idea of the tragedy of the commons. So the tragedy of the commons, you might be familiar with Garrett Hardin's essay from 1968, which basically says that, without any form of regulation, that people are going to act self-interestedly and selfishly and basically destroy the commons. So, the idea here is that then we need some kinds of regulation to basically enforce or incentivize people to collaborate. So, yeah, what I feel is problematic about this then is that it's kind of hoping that if we set up the right rules that we're going to produce a new kind of society, but these rules actually, I think they cultivate the very subjectivity that we're trying to get away from. And that's potentially what's sort of problematic about some of these kind of blockchain proposals. That all we need to do is incentivize people to contribute, and that trust mechanisms and forms of cooperation can be delegated to technology, so we don't really need to cooperate anymore. So yeah, but there I wanted to finish maybe then with a few conclusions. So this isn't kind of supposed to maybe foreclose the idea of using distributed ledger technologies in different ways. It's not saying necessarily that decentralized ledgers are a bad thing, but that there's a number of considerations that we should take into account. The first being that we need to understand the politics of automated governance and maybe move beyond this emphasis on kind of automating different forms of cooperation. I think actually the panel before this, if any of you were at that, which was looking at alternative forms of social reproduction of the commons, particularly from kind of a feminist point, maybe has possibilities there for thinking about ways of encouraging other kinds of subjectivities for the commons that need to be taken into account. So maybe, a more human or an infrastructure of care as opposed to this kind of automated infrastructure. I think maybe recognizing the need for a politics of dissent, so not just something where it's about agreeing and everything being transparent, but actually allowing for some kind of radical possibility. And then I guess, finally maybe trying to think again about ways of cultivating a politics of the commons that nurtures other subjectivities. Again, I actually feel like some of the talks that took place this morning sort of spoke about how to do that. Okay, I'm going to leave it there.
I guess we can take questions. Is there just one microphone?
Will I pass this one down?
Thanks. Hello. Yes. Sorry to be again the person who asked a question. I was thinking, do you have interesting cases of city governments implementing blockchain applications in providing the certain public services that you could recommend us to run some pilot here in Barcelona, for example?
Well, I'll let you jump in a sec, but I think there actually aren't that many that are actually well implemented. So there's been proposals. So there was that Honduras proposal for the land registry, which actually didn't take off. There was work around the Isle of Man, I think, who are also working with a blockchain startup. But yeah, for me, the one that maybe gave the most practical examples actually is that UK report. Now, how they actually work in practice, I can't really say.
I mean, I think there is a lot of discussion going on in like different fields. I think the closest thing was really the Honduras that actually really claimed that they wanted to move forwards with that, and they eventually didn't work out. I will say that like it's a really emergent technology, so it's kind of anyhow it's an experiment. I think it's necessary that eventually people start experimenting with this, but it's a little bit early, and I think at the moment we are still formalizing and trying to understand exactly what are the applications that make sense and which one are the ones that do not make so much sense. I will say that I think for like registries, it's almost straightforward, right? So I think that could be one of the first pilot to experiment, and it will be really interesting if, for instance, the Barcelona municipality wanted to actually, as a collateral, not to get rid completely of the current system, but to experiment and slowly compare and see what are the advantage and the con.
Hi. I'm a bit curious about the permissioned blockchain. I have the feeling that the bank system don't like too much Bitcoin, see that Bitcoin it's based on blockchain, want to try to separate these two things, take blockchain and use it. But I don't understand if they have the okay, they eliminate many future doing like that, and I have the sensation that one of these future is the uh, no yeah, okay, but, no, it's the security. Um, I would like to know if you have an opinion about that.
So I think there is two important components, two important phases to the blockchain. One is the trustlessness, and the other, which goes along it, is the inability to control it. Right? The more it is trustless, the least you can control it, and the condition for not being able to control it is that it's trustless. So of course, you have to choose. You have to get bought, right? So in the context of banks or actually just corporation, they actually want to control it, and because they want to control it, they lose the trustlessness. So this means that, of course, it's much more efficient for them because they have full control over the blockchain, but then you need to trust them again, right? So in the case of banks, if the blockchain was actually introduced as this disruptive technology that could disintermediate the financial operator, but now you have actual financial operators that are exploring this technology with permission blockchain in order to control every transaction that goes down. And then this means that this trustlessness goes back into trusting the financial institution. In some way it makes sense because obviously, in the same way, you have your intranet, you have companies that there is not always the need to put everything publicly available in the public internet. In the same way, you don't always need to put everything publicly available on the public blockchain. So there are many applications in which it actually makes sense to have a permission blockchain, but it has to be recognized that this comes at the cost of not having a trustless blockchain anymore. And I think that eventually probably it will happen that you will have a few permission blockchain internally, and then you can export the let's say the aggregate information into a more secure, trustless blockchain, which is public. So you could have this kind of different layered system in the same way as you have intranet, and then you can put information on the public internet when you want to rely on the publicness of it. So when you can operate internally on a permission blockchain, and then you can put the ultimate account, for instance, on a trustless blockchain. This is a possibility, for instance.
Thank you.
I had a quick question for you about the smart contracts, just in terms of what you thought about this idea of transparency, because I think there's different kinds of transparency in terms of something being visible and then something being legible to my mum, for example. If she wanted to use a blockchain, that it wouldn't be remotely legible to her what was going on. And so there's maybe this sort of trade-off between kind of user experience and design and then legibility. So I'm thinking of when I was over in New York in October, there was a presentation by this guy from a company called Ascribe. It wasn't Ascribe. Sorry, it was like Ascribe. It's called MoneyGraph. But it was basically he's developing smart contracts on the blockchain to allow artists to share their work and to create kind of more nuanced licenses for their work. But the problem obviously was that the artists then, and I was actually interviewing artists at the time to see what they thought about it, they weren't interested in learning anything about blockchain technology or engaging with it. So he was trying to develop a user interface to make then this, more usable for people. And in order to do that, he created a, really nice interface with a number of just pictures that were kind of icons that you could select to construct the kind of license you wanted. And this was kind of great in one way because it allowed people to just very, very quickly construct the kind of permissions that they wanted and write these then to the blockchain. But you kind of had to wonder what's happening between this very readable interface and then sort of the code underneath. I don't know. Can we really speak about, you know, something that's combining kind of legal infrastructures and legal, you know, systems, and then a sort of technical systems as being truly legible for anybody but like super like law geeks? I don't know.
Well, I think the first thing is that even though the smart contracts are actually claimed to be like open and like actually completely legible because everyone in the network needs to execute them, in fact, it's not even open source, because open source means that you actually can see the code that has generated the execution, but it's open state. So the smart contract is actually compiled already into opcodes, and those opcodes do not make pretty much any sense to anyone. So you can see what is the code that is being executed, but you cannot really parse it from a human perspective. On the other hand, you can always use this as a proof that this is what is being executed. So, for instance, if you look at the blockchain, you see these open state opcodes, and you probably have no idea what is going. But if you show me the source code, I can always compare that source code. Well, I can always compile this source code into an opcode and compare that this is indeed what is going on. So it's more in a form of it's transparency in the terms of accountability. So you can prove that this is indeed what is being executed. But this doesn't mean that if you just look at the blockchain, you necessarily can infer back on your own what is the execution. You could, if you really spend hours and hours into looking at what is going on. So it's this kind of like, there's actually, I think, in terms of narrative, like oftentimes it's just say that it is open source and that anyone can always see and look exactly what is happening. It is true to an extent, but it's really complicated for anyone to really do it.
So does that mean that inevitably we're going to have new intermediaries maybe who come forward to actually to verify or to gatekeep that the kind of that data? I sometimes wonder if that's not inevitable, to have people who are actually handling that for you. So there will be new trusted intermediaries and new kinds of centralization.
I will say that it's more like maybe in the open source sense. So not everybody can read the source code of many software, but you have like many eyes. So if I'm claiming that my software is this, and anyone can actually verify that, and then everyone can actually look at the source code and verify that it does something. It doesn't mean that you cannot have smart contracts that are actually not disclosed, that the source code is never disclosed, and you can only see at the opcode. And in this case, it's going to be really difficult. But I wouldn't say that this necessarily lead to a re-centralization. At least it leads to a fact that you need to have really high technical knowledge, but anyone can actually look at it nonetheless. So it's not a gatekeeping form of centralization. It's just, I think people will need to be really well educated to understand exactly what the software does. And I think for what concerns like the legal profession, I actually think that more and more, but this is not just because of the blockchain, I think in general, more and more lawyers actually need to eventually get more acquainted with technology and to understand how the technology goes, because indeed technology is turning into law. And if people like coders are really stuck into this old paradigm of like just drafting millions of lines of a document, and I think it's actually time that they optimize themselves a little bit as well. So I think on the one hand, the legal profession needs to move a little bit towards the technology. On the other hand, we need to be obviously like really careful not to have this takeover of the technology over the legal system, because this is really having really significant and fundamental shift into the way in which you think about law otherwise.
One last question, or
Can I ask a question to the room? Who actually think that the blockchain could be useful for public administration, and if so, on which aspect?
Sure. And in transparency, I mean, if the game is inverted, instead of we are watched from the sorry. Yes, for me it's the end point of the blockchain revolution, let's say. would central status that, from the point of view of the accountability, is 100% visible for the citizen. So if citizen can see the movement of money, the corruption and the inefficiency should go lower. So this one, I think, it's the main apport that can arrive to the government. It will need time, I think.
And who thinks that it's actually a really bad idea?
I think that it's maybe a bad idea because there's no enough information about what it technically is, because there's no education about programming or computing science. And for example, the open code, the source code, it's very difficult to explain to other people that don't know how to code, what is code, and we have to. First, more education about what is technology and trust about technology. I don't know.
I just feel like if you read books from 2002 or 2004, you hear about how Wi-Fi is going to revolutionize the mobile internet. If you read books, from the kind of late 90s, it's about how the end-to-end principle is going to change everything. And I kind of feel like we're at this, even though the pace is actually much faster, we're at this moment where, we're going to build our own utopias, but we're already seeing this kind of rapid forms of centralization happening around the blockchain. So it's this kind of possibility that I think is even though there are maybe potentially good applications, that they're escaping from us before we can even get a hold of them. I don't know. That's a really grim note to finish on.
Just not to finish on a completely negative note. I think obviously it's really early, but I think that we need to go really slowly, step by step. And I think, of course, it's not the time to replace everything with blockchain technology. But I think there is a very few, really little, but really fundamental elements, such as, for instance, registries, which is actually really important for corporate governance. So the ability of promoting more accountability and transparency into the way in which organizations are orchestrated, which doesn't mean at all to automate everything and to rely on distributed autonomous organization, but it's actually to incorporate the technology within the current organization and within the current practices in order to promote a gradual movement from more transparency and more technical accountability, which I think it's actually a positive thing if we really frame the boundaries really well. And we should be careful not to go too far, at least not too far too soon, because of course otherwise we just go into these really mushy grounds. But I think there is already, for me personally, I think the registry and notary services and things like this is kind of so basic, and I don't see much negative things that can come out of it, except for an actual resilient, incorruptible and transparent registry.
What do you think about the voting system on blockchain for government or e-residency, like Estonia is making on a digital ID card?
So I think the problem today is that voting system needs two basic features. One is the ability to verify that your vote has been counted. And this is really nice because blockchain actually provides this kind of verifiability. The other thing is the secrecy, right? So the fact that you cannot show in any way who you did vote for. And this at the moment...
And not corruptible too.
Yeah, exactly. If I can prove who I voted for, I can be corrupted, right? And this at the moment, it doesn't mean that it's not going to actually change, because there is lots of research going on and lots of people that claim that this is actually going to be possible eventually. But at the moment, the technology is not mature enough to actually provide secrecy in the voting. So I think for every vote in which secrecy is not important, where on the contrary you actually want transparency and verifiability, it's really useful. but you cannot use it for an actual secret voting system.
Thank you.
Until now.
One more question. I went a minute talking about smart contracts. I wanted to ask you if you see a really applicability of smart contract without a really transparent and trustable oracles which provide and feed data to them. If you can see a really applicable of smart contract, I talk about Ethereum, but not only, without a fully transparent and trustable oracles which provide data to smart contracts.
Yeah, so just to translate to the people that don't know what oracle means. So the blockchain is unaware of what happens outside of the blockchain. That's one of the feature and limitation. If you want to remain trustless, you have to remain on the blockchain. So the oracle is this kind of figure, software or whatever, that is actually taking information, is a sensor, is the real world sensor, taking information from the real world and introducing it into the blockchain so that smart contracts which only know the blockchain can actually interact with this data. So I think and I think that's why if you look at current application of smart contracts, it's mostly financial applications, because financial applications do not need to rely on anything but what is existing today on the blockchain, so you don't need to rely on oracles, right? I think if you actually want real use of smart contract beyond financial application or perhaps beyond IoTs, which have really limited application, definitely you will need to, and that's where the trustlessness breaks, right? So as soon as you introduce something that is off-chain, then you don't rely on this trustless technology anymore. Then you can have mechanism of multiple oracles and figuring out what is the consensus between all the oracles, but it will always be less trustless than if it's only on the blockchain.
That was actually kind of reminds me of something that I, if we have time, maybe wanted to ask, well, the room, but also you about, which is that it seems that as they scale up, that then you inevitably do have. Oh, sorry. I just guessed, yeah, if we had enough time, that one thing that seems to be the case is, when we're starting to deal with issues about scalability and in terms of verifying that it seems inevitable, even if you want, a permissionless blockchain, even if you want decentralization, which isn't what the majority of people working with blockchain do want, that you end up with these systems where you have to you do have to have some kinds of permissions, or you need multiple blockchains chained together at side chains, or you need to decide that you need different kinds of sharding, or to decide that certain people are going to verify that as much as you want to keep it decentralized, that actually in terms of from an efficiency point of view, once they start to scale up, that you have these forms of centralization. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I just don't know.
I mean, I don't know about centralization, but I would say it's more about trustlessness and trust. And
I mean centralization in terms of that you have to you have to say that you are going to be, it's going to be this subset of this particular group that are going to verify these transactions. That way, or we're going to have to. Yeah, sorry.
I mean, I think the blockchain is as a purely decentralized technology is dangerously subject to this possible co-option, just as we have seen with Bitcoin, which has been slowly co-opted at the mining level, which is centralized at the development level, which is subject to really centralized system of communication and media and etc. So there is obviously, because it's so decentralized, there is a danger that because it's so decentralized, there is a danger that established power try and actually it's the tyranny of the unstructuredness, right? So obviously this is subject to this, but if to connect with this discussion, I think the main thing is that yes, when the blockchain wants to be used more for other kinds of application, which goes beyond the trustlessness of financial application, I actually think the the really important element of it is not necessarily the trustlessness. I actually think that many things in real life, we don't actually want trustlessness, and we probably don't want to create, like, scale up the trustlessness into everyday society. On the other hand, I think that more and more we can actually use the blockchain as a mediator for trusted relation. And I think where the real important value lies is on the procedure. It's actually like, it's this technical due process to some extent. And I can interact with you, and actually I want to trust you, and I don't want to have a trustless interaction, right? Unless you want to give me money. But the blockchain is just like this platform in which you can encode a procedure, and then you can have whatever trust oracles and human being actually interacting through this platform. And the value is just that you know that the procedure by which people will interact is encoded and is transparently visible on the blockchain. But I don't think it's not going to be trustless at this point. It's just going to be a transparent and technically enforced procedure of interaction. But the interaction will always have an element of trust, because whenever there is oracles or whenever there is human being interacting with the blockchain, there is always trust that comes in. And I think that's the important distinction to make, because I think it's really actually scary to think that we are trying to use this blockchain in order to create a trustless society, because no one wants to live in a trustless society. But I think, on the contrary, it's actually interesting to figure out how we can bring back trust into the blockchain and just rely on the technology to coordinate this trust.
No, I completely agree.
One last question here? Yeah. Well, first, just answering your question, I'm not fully understanding the whole technology, but I think we have hope if everything works on, as you said, at least to reduce corruption, for example. For me, it would be a really, really key instrument. And I was wondering, in a basic level, as you said, for notarial registration and things like that, did you ever consider or heard anything about, let's say, university paperwork documents that could be good across the world? Anyone that ever tried to get documents from university to another country, is just unbelievable hard and stupid in the way we are today, that universities do not talk to each other. And I think it would be very easy and simple to have a universal database. It's a very basic thing, but it's just unbelievable that we didn't reach this issue right now. And talking to university could be easier because you're supposed to be in a high level intellectual or whatever people concerned about how we could use that in that way.
I think a pretty nice application, which, yeah, I think you're dead right, and probably a nice application. One I've seen, I don't know, I've seen pilots of when I was over in MIT, was to develop kind of new forms of, I suppose, fluidity around health data. So, which maybe actually experiences some of the difficulties that you were speaking about in terms of actually transferring that from one doctor to another or so on. And I actually thought that was a pretty good application in terms of allowing you to protect that data, but also making it more easy for you to share that if you moved, from one country to another, or if you moved from one doctor to the other. Obviously, there's potential drawbacks in terms of any time, I suppose, you're making that data move easier. You're also making it, maybe it enters kind of other kinds of circulation, whether that's insurance and health data and so on. But yeah, I don't see why not. I actually think some of that kind of making sensitive documents maybe more easy or to share, and making permissions around those easier is a pretty good application.
It is actually already lunchtime, but we had one more question. Do you allow that one?
Okay, apologies for stealing lunchtime. Just quickly, because I found that point on the trust question so important. Like in the basic anti-corruption concepts would always say, okay, in order to fight corruption, you need transparency, accountability, and integrity. So if blockchain can provide accountability and transparency, that by itself would just not be enough. You have many processes where you have accountability and transparency, and it just doesn't help fighting corruption. So the question is now how to achieve that integrity, which is about people and trust and actually, personal integrity of people. And connected to that, I wanted to ask, how do you estimate the blockchain community? I've been talking to a couple of people, and they seem very diverse, but there seem to be some enthusiasts who are mostly about the technical side, and they're very fascinated by what is possible. They don't care so much about the political implications. And then there are banks, and people working for banks, and people being bought by banks. And this is my question, like, how do you estimate the blockchain community? Are they strong enough in terms of integrity to use that technology or bring it into a useful, productive path?
I think the fintech is like the most powerful kind of part of that community. So I think you can break it down in lots of different ways. The way I was breaking it down earlier was that maybe you have this sort of more communist, might be not necessarily anarchist, but people who want to use it for commons-based peer production, and that's a small group. And then the main community is fintech, so this like Silicon Valley, bringing Silicon Valley ideologies to the financial sector as a way of trying to foreclose some of the financial crisis of like 2008, so making those systems more robust. And that is, from what I can see, that's the really, really big one. And then maybe that we have public institutions as well who are starting to look at using it. I'm not sure. I think that's always the question though. So is your kind of commons-based peer-to-peer digital activist community going to be strong enough to kind of eke out some kind of a space in place of those? And then that, I don't know, maybe you want to look at the question of the trust. Yeah.
I just want to say that actually I think that the technology is still being built and it's still emerging, and I actually think it's dangerous to look at who are the current communities around the blockchain, because they're actually mostly crypto libertarians, banks and corporate and whatever. But actually, at least from my personal point of view, I think this technology can highly benefit the commons, because it enables those new form of distributed governance and more decentralized organizations. And my feeling, at least in the past year, is that because of the stigmatization that has happened due to mostly Bitcoin, then the commons-based communities are actually a little bit like scared or disgusted by the blockchain. And this is actually changing since a few months, maybe now, that there is much more openness and much more eager to actually explore this technology. But I will say that, we have to be the integral community that is actually pushing this technology in the right direction at the same time. So of course there will always be the corporate, and there will always be like the crypto libertarian and whatever, but there can also be the common-based community that is actually putting its own principle into the technology and is using it for its own purpose. So in some way, at the moment it's a very small part, but I think that it has a lot of benefits that it can bring, both for public administration, for commons-based, etc. And so I think we should not just stay away from the technology just because someone else is already looking at it. But on the contrary, we should actually jump in and try and shift the focus and try and develop those new applications that are actually furthering the common according to the principle of the commons.
Thank you very much.